Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2019 Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. We have an outstanding lineup of speakers today. This evening, Kimberly Strassel from the Wall Street Journal will be with us. We have Mark Janis in the house, Kay Cole James, Timothy Gegline, Jimmy Kemp, and many others. And here to introduce our first speaker, our traditional kickoff speaker, for many, many years here at the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference, I would like to bring to the stage the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association, David Taylor. David?
Thank you, and welcome to all to the 2019 Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. As chairman of the Pennsylvania Leadership Council, I am honored to introduce our first distinguished speaker, a longtime friend to all of us in the conservative movement and a regular PLC guest since the year 2001. U.S. Senator Pat Toomey has a sterling record as a champion of limited government, pro-growth economics, and upholding our constitutional order. Named a taxpayer superhero by Citizens Against Government Waste, Pat Toomey fought back against the unconstitutional actions of the Obama administration, including unilateral power grabs like DACA, recess appointments, and arbitrary rewrites of Obamacare. In the Trump era, Pat was a main author of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is driving economic growth. He's advanced regulatory reform, clearing the books of old rules that don't work anymore. Pat continues to fight dangerous sanctuary cities and stands ready to fund a secure border and to uphold the integrity of citizenship. He voted for Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh, and many other conservative jurists. A defender of the innocent unborn, Pat has a 100% pro-life voting record. Senator Toomey is a consistent, principled, conservative leader for Pennsylvania. Please join me in welcoming back our friend, Pat Toomey.
Thank you very much. It is great to be back and great to be here for the kickoff once again of this great occasion. David, thank you very much for that kind introduction. David's introduction was very generous. It reminds me of my favorite introduction story of a very different kind of introduction. You may have heard the story about Dr. Henry Kissinger when he was the Secretary of State. There was a very important occasion, and it was a big room, and there was 1,000 people, a very distinguished group that he was addressing. And there was a suitably distinguished individual was selected to do the introduction of Dr. Kissinger. So this guy walked up to the podium, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, a man who needs no introduction, Henry Kissinger." So Dr. Kissinger walks up to the podium, and he said, "Well, it is true, I need no introduction. Still, one would be nice." So David, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Congratulations to Lowman Henry on your leadership of this great event. Congratulations to the PLC. Hey, great job getting Kim Strassel. Kim Strassel is absolutely terrific. I'm sure you're going to enjoy her presentation tonight, and her weekly column, The Potomac Watch, is a must-read for me anyway. What I want to talk about a little bit today is, first of all, I want to take a victory lap. I want to talk about some of the accomplishments that our president and a Republican Congress achieved in the last Congress, but I also want to give a warning about some of the dangers that I think we face. I think it's fair to say that we're in one of the most polarized and challenging political environments in certainly a very long time. And despite that, I would argue we had the most successful Congress last Congress. This president has had the most successful first 2 years of any time I can think of, certainly for a conservative, center-right Republican point of view. It started, arguably, before the Congress actually began. I think it started when the Republicans in the United States Senate had the good sense to follow the Biden-Schumer rule and leave open the seat created by the passing of Justice Alito. That was an important moment. Remember that Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer told us with 18 months left in the Bush administration that they would refuse to confirm a Supreme Court justice if a vacancy occurred. Well, with about 8 months before the election, we Republican senators were in complete agreement. We were going to let the American people decide how that vacancy would be filled, and that's exactly what we did, and as a result, we confirmed Neil Gorsuch, who is going to be a terrific, terrific justice. But we didn't stop there. On the judicial front, as you may know, in the last Congress, we confirmed 30 appellate court judges, 30 circuit court judges, giving President Trump more confirmed appellate court judges than any president in American history has ever gotten in his first 2 years in office. And that's not to mention the dozens and dozens of district court judges that we confirmed despite tremendous obstacles that were put in our way by our Democratic colleagues. More on that in a minute. Another whole category of success in the last Congress was the joint administrative and congressional rollback of the excessive regulation that had been piling up for years, especially because of the previous administration. The Trump administration repealed regulations that they had the authority to repeal unilaterally, saving about $15 billion in 2017 and 2018. And they adopted a very sensible rule, which was that for every new regulation passed, they were going to repeal 2. And in Congress, we resurrected a bill that had only been used once before, a statute, I should say, that had only been used once before to repeal a regulation. We revived it, and 16 times using this legislation, and therefore being able to pass in the Senate with a simple majority vote, we repealed onerous and ill-conceived regulations from the Obama era, saving $36 billion. We had some modest victories, rolling back Dodd-Frank as well, but there was a concerted effort to lighten the regulatory burdens that had been imposed in recent years. Another whole category of success was enabling the dramatic expansion of U.S. energy production. This has been a really, really big deal, and I'm very proud of this. A lot of it was about allowing basic energy infrastructure to go forward. Pipelines like the Keystone Pipeline and new natural gas pipelines, LNG export terminals, and Congress overturned an EPA regulation that would have been devastating to the coal industry. And of course, maybe most significant of all was we finally opened up ANWR for responsible development. The people of Alaska had waited 38 years to develop one of the world's richest sources of oil and gas, and now, because of our legislation, that's underway. Rebuilding our military, a priority of both the Trump administration and the Republican Congress. I think the administration has correctly shifted our top priority focus to building a force that's capable of defeating great powers. We had focused a lot on terrorism, understandably. Now I think the greatest risk to us is the rise of competitive great powers. Congress agreed to increase by $165 billion over 2 years defense spending because President Obama let it languish and really underfunded our defensive capabilities for years. That's a big increase, an important one. On Obamacare, we had a big disappointment when several of my colleagues couldn't bring themselves to the vote that would have repealed Obamacare, but we were able later to take one of the most egregious features of Obamacare, the individual mandate, and eliminate the financial penalty for noncompliance so that, at least for individuals, compliance with Obamacare is now essentially voluntary. And we've created whole new categories of choices in health care for people that give them more choices and lower costs than we had before. And then finally, well, not finally, I got 2 left, actually. Tax reform. This is the biggest tax reform in 31 years, easily. We lowered taxes for every single category of income earner. 93% of all individuals and families see a reduction in their tax burden. And we made our business tax code competitive again. No more punishing companies that have income overseas that when they bring it back home, so that they will bring it back home and invest it in America, making American business and workers competitive. And finally, and this really is finally, we all remember late last year when some of our Democratic colleagues launched an absolutely unprecedented smear campaign against a very good man. Completely unsubstantiated character assassination attacks. And some of us were told You're a man, so shut up and believe all accusations, however implausible or unsubstantiated. It was really an ugly moment, and a very good man was dragged through the mud. And as a matter of fact, some of my Senate colleagues were threatened. One was assaulted. But in the end, all but one of us held together, and we confirmed Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, and he's going to be a great Supreme Court justice. So when you look back, 30 circuit court judges, 2 Supreme Court justices, dozens and dozens of regulations, unleashing American energy, rebuilding our military, and the most important tax reform in 31 years, that's a pretty good Congress, if you ask me. And it's fair to ask, well, what are the results of that? What's happened as a result of Republican policies being enacted because we controlled the government? Well, I would say, in a nutshell, one of the results is the strongest economy of my lifetime. An absolutely booming economy, where economic growth has hit a more than 10-year high. The U.S. is now the world's #1 producer of energy. We added 2.6 million jobs last year alone. That is 3 times the average annual job production under the Obama administration. The unemployment rate hit a 50-year low late last year at 3.7%. Today it's 3.8%, it's essentially the same number. We have the lowest number of people requesting unemployment benefits since 1969, when we were a much smaller country. It's amazing. African American and Hispanic unemployment at an all-time record low today. Youth unemployment at a 50-year low. Wages growing faster than they've grown in over a decade. And for the first time, I think since we've ever tracked this data, certainly the first time in my adult lifetime, there are more job openings today in America than there are people looking for work. That's what a good economy looks like. That's what it looks like. So look, this is a Republican Congress working with a Republican President Trump and spending 2 years accomplishing the very things that we have long wanted to accomplish. I consider myself extremely fortunate that I was able to play a central role in some of these efforts. Tax reform was one of them. There were 4 of us, 4 Republican senators asked to design the Senate version of this tax reform and usher it through the Senate. I was really pleased when we were able to hold every single Republican senator for that tax reform. My team and I established a whole new precedent for repealing ill-conceived regulations, some of which date back a long time, and working closely with the President and his team at the White House in helping to select and confirm great conservatives to the Pennsylvania court and beyond. So it's been tremendously productive. Now, let me be candid. I don't agree with anyone on everything. Just please don't tell my wife that. And obviously, I was elected separately from the President. So there are going to be times that we're going to have disagreements. And I want to talk about one that was a recent case, and that was the case of the National Emergency Declaration. One of the ironies of this whole situation is that the President and I fully share the goal of securing our southern border, and I agree with the President that that absolutely requires additional border wall construction. We have a crisis at our southern border. We have a crisis today. There's too much drugs coming across. There's human trafficking. There's the sheer number of illegal immigrants coming across the border. There's a record number of apprehensions in recent months. And there's an appalling, really, really horrific and tragic exploitation of children because smugglers and people wanting to come here illegally have figured out that a child can be your ticket into America. It's absolutely terrible. And we need to expand the border walls that we have because that's part of the solution. It's common sense. Walls work. The Border Patrol are the experts that we ask to protect us and to protect that border. They've said we need to expand the border wall construction. And so I fully support this construction as the President does. Last year, I voted for $18 billion of additional border wall construction per se. And earlier this year, the President sent a request to Congress for $5.7 billion, which I believe, and I've said publicly repeatedly, is a very reasonable request. And as we all know, that set off a big battle with Congress. because the Speaker of the House decided that the only acceptable number to be spent on border construction, on wall construction, is 0. That was the only acceptable number. Now, the President was being completely reasonable and suggesting a number that was consistent with what the Border Patrol said they needed, and Speaker Pelosi was at 0. So that led to a big fight. We had the government shutdown. In the end, an appropriation bill was agreed to that had $1.4 billion worth of funding for border wall construction. My view is that was too low. I didn't think that was adequate. Actually, I voted against the bill. It did have $22 billion for non-wall security. That's a good thing, but here's the thing that's important. There are other sources of funds available to the President, and he's going to use other sources of funds. In fact, there are enough other sources of funds that the President can have more than $5.7 billion, which is what he requested and I support. I'm happy to tell you, it's pretty simple. There's the $1.4 billion in the appropriation bill. There's another $600 million in civil asset forfeiture. This is typically money from drug dealers and terrorists when we bust them and grab their cash. So if you add those two, you're at $2 billion. And then there's an allocation of funds specifically allocated in congressional legislation whereby the President has discretion to spend up to $4 billion from Defense Department funds for the purpose of building a border wall to impede the flow of drugs into the country. That all adds up to $6 billion. Now, I've rounded. It's really closer to 5.9, but it's more than the $5.7 billion. And I had urged the President and his team, use those sources, fully fund your request. Every 100% of Republican senators, including me, will be cheerleaders for this approach. Instead, as we know, the President issued a national emergency declaration, and the purpose of that was to repurpose funds that Congress had specifically appropriated for military construction on military bases. So the vote on this, to me, was certainly not about the border wall. I support building the border wall and spending what it takes to get it done. For me, it was about the source of funds, and specifically one category of the source of funds. And it was about the separation of powers in the Constitution that I think is important. I also have to say I think it is a dangerous precedent. Now, it's true, elected Democrats might very well abuse this statutory authority regardless of what we do. That's a risk. But if we use a national emergency declaration to circumvent a congressional appropriation, then I think we invite Democratic abuse of this. And it was particularly perplexing to me to use it when it wasn't necessary to get the funding that we do in fact need. You know, Elizabeth Warren has already told us that she wants to issue a national emergency declaration for climate change. And seriously. And who knows how she'd like to redirect military construction money if she thinks she can. So, you know, the bottom line is the President and I completely agree on the need for border wall construction. We disagreed over one portion of the source of that funding. But with or without the national emergency declaration, the President can and will build about 235 miles of additional border wall construction. I will tell you, the problem with legislative solutions for our border crisis isn't Republicans. The problem is the increasingly radicalized Democrats in Congress. They're now openly embracing open borders. I mean, as I said, Nancy Pelosi declared that a border wall is intrinsically immoral. She didn't seem to mind so much when the last 4 consecutive presidents added to existing border wall funding, but somehow when President Trump wants to do it, it's immoral. And she didn't seem to mind when Senate Democrats voted for almost $20 billion in border wall construction a year ago, or the previous year before President Trump had asked for this, but now it's immoral. And then Beto O'Rourke. He at least understands the logic of Nancy Pelosi's position. And the logic is, if it's immoral, then it's not just that you can't build new stretches of border wall. The existing walls have to come down. And that's his position, tear down the walls. And of course, it's become commonplace now for our Democratic colleagues to advocate the abolition of ICE. So we're not supposed to have any enforcement of our immigration law, according to their worldview. It's just unbelievable. Congressional Democrats are now increasingly being dominated by the socialist far-left wing of their party. You know, honestly, for years, I would hear Republicans occasionally, jokingly, disparaging, but in a light, humorous way, refer to Democrats as socialists, right? It was hyperbole. It was a joke. They weren't really socialists. Guess what? Now they are, and they admit to it. It's unbelievable. It's a huge, huge problem. So look at what they want to do. Look at what their policy agenda is. First, it starts with undoing all of the progress we made in the first 2 years. That whole litany that I went through earlier, which is resulting in the strongest economy of our lifetimes, and they want to undo it. Certainly repeal the tax reform. You've heard they're competing to see who can propose the most egregious tax burden on Americans. They want to reimpose the regulatory regime. What do you think that would do to the economy? But that's not enough. Now they have a Green New Deal, which, let's be honest, it should be called the Red New Deal. It starts with a complete government takeover of health care, banning private insurance. The 160 million Americans who get their health insurance from their employer or their spouse's employer. No more under their worldview. I guess the government did such a great job on Obamacare, might as well just make it universal. And by the way, what does that have to do with the green? I don't get it. But there are parts that are tied to their views on energy, like they want to eliminate entirely the use of natural gas and other fossil fuels. I suppose they'll pass a law that requires the sun to shine and the wind to blow on days like today. They want to phase out air travel as we know it and within the foreseeable future. Now, they can't figure out how to make a high-speed train connect Los Angeles and San Francisco, but we're expected to believe that you can connect every city in America to every other city and do it with electric trains. Seriously. They want to force the renovation of every building in America, every home, every office building, every building of every kind, to meet their energy efficiency. And then, of course, you had an early fact sheet where AOC came out and demanded that the government guarantee a paycheck for everyone, including people who are unwilling to work. You can't make this stuff up. But there are other aspects of their agenda that in some ways is even more troubling. One of them is the elected Democrats who are clearly on an extended campaign to delegitimize President Trump. These are folks who cannot accept the outcome of the 2016 election, and they don't intend to. And they're opposing him at every step along the way. One egregious example is the Senate Democrats making it almost impossible for the president to populate the executive branch of government, the sub-cabinet level officials that are needed to carry out his agenda. What they're doing is delaying confirmations dramatically. And then, of course, there's the investigative harassment, which is a whole new order of magnitude. Let me mention the nominees. The Senate Democrats have been engaging in an absolutely unprecedented obstruction of the president's nominees, and I can illustrate this with a statistic that's important. So there is a procedural vote that's available to a senator who wants to create a delay on the confirmation of a nominee. It's called a cloture vote, and it allows for a 36-hour delay before you can even have a vote to confirm the nominee. That may not sound like a long time, but there are thousands of people who are subject to Senate confirmation votes. You multiply 36 hours times thousands, and obviously it starts to become a very, very long time. Well, over the course of the Obama, Bush II, and Clinton presidencies, 24 years, this procedural delay was invoked. It was invoked 24 times. 24 times in 24 years. According to my math, that's an average of one a year. I'm pretty good with math. One a year. Well, in the first 2 years of President Trump's presidency, our Democratic colleagues in the Senate used this procedural tactic to delay confirmation of President Trump's nominees. You ready? 128 times. 128 times. So 24 times in 24 years under 3 different presidents of both parties, and then 128 times in 2 years because they didn't want Donald Trump to be able to populate his government. Well, I'm proud to tell you that finally, Republican senators decided enough is enough. They've gone overboard. It took a while to get there, but this past Wednesday, we hung together and we voted to change the rules of the Senate so they will not be able to engage in those tactics anymore. And, you know, there may be no better example of the attempts of some of my Democratic colleagues to delegitimize the president than their obsession and mischaracterization of the investigation, the collusion charges, their reaction to the Mueller report. So let's start with the obvious fact. The Mueller report is out. The conclusion is clear. The president is completely exonerated of any charges of collusion. That's not ambiguous, right? Now, for 2 years, we heard from my Democratic colleagues that Bob Mueller walks on water, right? Whatever Bob Mueller says, right? We had to go to great lengths to insist that the Mueller report be finished because the Mueller report is the final, definitive, authoritative word. That's what we heard for 2 years. They wanted us to pass legislation that would forbid the president from firing Mueller because they were convinced that was imminent. Well, the report's out. And I know this is shocking, but it's not good enough. Of course it's not. There's nothing is good enough for some of these folks. So now they want to subpoena the entire report, including parts that undoubtedly contain sensitive and classified information. The head of the House Judiciary Committee has issued 81 subpoenas to investigate every aspect of President Trump's life, I think, from the time he started kindergarten. And there's a new development, which is the unprecedented attempt to weaponize the authority of the Tax Writing Committee, the House Ways and Means Committee. They're insisting on being able to look at several years' worth of President Trump's tax returns. This is unprecedented. It's absolutely a level of harassment that is unprecedented. I'll tell you what we ought to be doing, and Lindsey Graham, my colleague from South Carolina, is doing it, and that is an investigation of the 2016 decisions by the FBI and the Department of Justice. That's what we should be looking at. Let's be honest. It certainly looks like the FBI took a dossier that was put together by a discredited British spy using information from Russian sources paid for by the Clinton campaign in order to spy on an American presidential campaign. How is this okay? We need answers. And Lindsey Graham, I'm confident, is going to get to the bottom of this. So, having said all that, let me tell you another thing that should be very, very disturbing, I think, to all of us. And that is there is a movement on the left that goes beyond the attempt to delegitimize President Trump. It goes beyond a bunch of really radical socialist policies. It's an effort that is beginning, and it's really developing, to fundamentally rig the rules of American politics so that they get a majority that they can't lose. This strikes me as relatively new. They are so unwilling to accept the results of recent elections, especially President Trump's election, that they don't intend to live with ordinary election results anymore. Let me tell you, give you some examples of what I'm talking about here. The very first piece of legislation in the House of Representatives, H.R. 1, they passed this already. It's very symbolically important when they make this their very first bill. The title of it is For the People Act, and it pretends to be an election and campaign finance reform bill. It should be called the Democrat Politician Protection Act. It is, among other things, a taxpayer-funded bailout of the political class. It would require taxpayer-funded attack ads and robocalls and yard signs, taxpayer-funded. It's a breathtaking assault on the First Amendment. It would explicitly empower politicians to regulate speech. How is that possibly compatible with our First Amendment? And remember, this is the same party that under President Obama argued before the Supreme Court that the government ought to have the power to ban books if the books deal with politics during a campaign season. This is an outrageous infringement on our freedom, but it's for this bigger purpose. They also want to federalize the state voting systems, effectively wiping out registration and anti-fraud safeguards. They want automatic voter registration, including for people as young as 16 years old. And they're perfectly okay with vote harvesting. You know, this is the practice where you send campaign workers out with a ballot that's already checked off, and you ring the bell and say, Mr. Jones, this is how you wanted to vote, right? Just sign right here. Oh, how could anything possibly go wrong, right? In North Carolina, Republicans were found to have engaged in this activity, and it invalidated a congressional election. Democrats are perfectly fine with that. But that's just on the electoral side. Then you have the packing of the Supreme Court, right? This used to be just a fringe idea, hardly talked about in polite company. Now, Democratic presidential candidates and many others are openly advocating that since we probably have a majority of justices on the Supreme Court who think their job is actually to implement the Constitution and laws as they're written, rather than as the left wing would like them to have been written, that's not acceptable. And they're talking about simply adding enough justices so that they've got a majority of left-wingers. And remember, all it takes is a law to do that. The size of the Supreme Court is not established in the Constitution. This is a truly dangerous idea. Think of how it would undermine the legitimacy of the court. So, I mean, one of the crown jewels of the American governmental system is an independent judiciary. What they would do is make the Supreme Court of the United States an extension of the political branches of government. That's all it would be. The idea was floated by FDR in the 1930s, as historians among us will recall, and it was widely panned and discredited ever since. It wasn't really raised for many, many decades. It's back, and it's a high priority if they were to take back the Senate and the White House and continue to control the House. Oh, of course, they also want to eliminate the Electoral College. The Electoral College is extremely inconvenient for Democrats. Of course, it also happens to be enshrined in our Constitution, and it is the essential mechanism for ensuring the joint state and federal sovereignty that has been such an important source of a vibrant republic that we have. Oh, and D.C. statehood, can't forget that, and I'm sure it's just a coincidence that that would result in 2 more Democratic senators and a handful of Democratic House members. So, look, my point is, in addition to very, very dangerous and ill-conceived policies from government-run health care, the Green New Deal, the socialism, all of that is terrible enough. But there is a new threat out there, and that is the increasing intent of some on the left to systematically change the electoral and governing process so that they can achieve a majority and make it permanent. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is they can't do any of it as long as we're in control of any one of the elected branches of government. And right now we've got 2. We've got the White House and we've got the Senate. But I want to tell you that it is, to me, a very, very vivid picture that shows just how much elections matter. All elections matter, we know that. But when you consider this whole new level of this agenda, it makes the 2020 elections loom very, very large in my mind. And winning in 2020, let's make no doubt about this, winning in 2020 begins in 2019. So we've got a Superior Court seat that we've got to win. We've got a congressional seat. We're going to have a special election for a congressional seat that's been vacated by Tom Marino. Fred Keller is a great candidate. He's going to make a great congressman. We've got to make sure that he gets elected. We've got 2 state Senate special elections, and I'm confident we're going to win both of those. But we had a loss just earlier this week in the western part of the state. We've got to make sure we win those 2 that are up right now. We've got county courthouses. We've got district attorney. We've got a lot of elections we need to win this year for their own sake, but also because it helps to pave the way for an incredibly important election in 2020. Look, we're in a tough political environment. 2018 was a rough year for us, but I actually think 2020 could shape up quite well for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the strongest economy in our lifetimes. And as we go into these next election cycles, I'm reminded of the wisdom of the great Winston Churchill, who said about all of us, he said, you know, you can always count on the Americans to get it right after they've exhausted every other possible option. Well, we're going to get it right. We need your help to do it. Thank you very much for having me with you today.